Welcome to American History Lesson 22. The Great Depression. Our lesson objectives are: identify and understand how the failing economy spiraled out of control, identify the influence the stock market's crash had on American confidence, identify how social roles changed due to the economic depression, identify important actions taken by American leadership to try and fix the crisis. Before the collapse. Although the economy of the 1920s boomed, trouble lurked beneath the surface. The textile, steel, and railroad industries were barely profitable during the boom. Mining and lumbering industries were in a steady decline. In the late 1920s, the auto, construction, and consumer goods industries faltered. The biggest problem was in agriculture industry. Wartime demand for food dropped, and farmers no longer commanded the prices they did. Unable to make mortgage payments, many farmers lost their land. Congress tried to help farmers by passing laws that would boost food prices, but President Calvin Coolidge vetoed them. Farmers were often short on money, so they bought fewer goods. That trend, combined with the consumer debt load, cut consumer spending. Consumer spending was hurt by lagging incomes. These problems were not completely evident in the 1928 presidential election. Republican Herbert Hoover, pointing to years of prosperity under Presidents Harding and Coolidge, won the election over Democrat Al Smith. The unthinkable happens. Meanwhile, the stock market continued its amazing rise. People bought stocks, hoping to become rich. Many bought on margin, borrowing against future profits to pay for stocks today. If prices did not rise, though, there would be trouble. Stock prices began to decline in September of 1929. On October 29, known as Black Tuesday, they dropped sharply. More than 16 million shares of stocks were sold that day, until no more willing buyers could be found. By mid-November, investors had lost more than $30 billion. The great stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression. It didn't cause the depression, but it hurried and worsened the economic collapse. The main causes of the depression were the aging industrial base, farmers' problems, the problem of easy credit, and the fact that too few people held too great a share of the nation's wealth. President Hoover tried to reassure Americans that the economy would right itself. Many people panicked and pulled their money from banks. With so many withdrawals happening so suddenly, many banks were forced to close. When the banks failed, other depositors lost their deposits. Businesses began to close as well, and millions of Americans lost their jobs. Unemployment had been 3% in 1929. By 1933, it was 25%. Those who kept their jobs suffered pay cuts or reduced hours. The depression spread around the world. The drop in consumer demand in the United States cut European exports, hurting their economies. Congress passed a high tariff to reduce imports. They hoped to protect American industry, but instead cut the demand for American exports. The depression in the home. The depression devastated many Americans. With no jobs, millions of people went hungry or homeless. Cities across the country were full of people who had been thrown out of their apartments or homes because they couldn't meet mortgage or rent. Families slept under newspaper or built shanty towns on the outskirts of large cities. People stood in line to get food from soup kitchens set up by charities. African Americans and Hispanic Americans living in the city suffered greatly. Some suffered violence at the hands of angry whites who had lost their jobs. These groups had higher jobless rates and were given lower paying jobs. The depression hurt people in rural areas, although farmers could at least grow food. As food prices continued to fall, more and more farmers lost their farms from failure to meet mortgage payments. From 1929 to 1932, about 400,000 farmers lost their land. To worsen matters, a long drought struck the Great Plains. With the steady rains, farmlands could not grow enough crops or support its animals. When powerful winds swept the plains, they blew away the soil in vast dust storms, removing what was once fertile soil. The southern plains were hardest hit. Many Oklahoma farmers packed up their belongings and moved to California to find work as migrant farm workers. The depression placed heavy pressure on the family. Many men felt ashamed because they had lost their jobs and were so depressed that they abandoned their families. Women found work if they could to help, but they generally were paid less than men. Some people argued that employers should hire men rather than women since men were seen as the primary support for a family. Children suffered from poor diets and lack of health care. The number of children suffering illnesses due to lack of vitamins increased. Lacking money to continue, many school boards shut down schools or shortened the school year. Many children went to work to try to help their families to survive. The American leadership takes action. Economic slumps happen with some frequency. President Hoover at first believed that the Depression was simply another slump that would end. Officials in his administration thought it was best to do nothing and let the economy heal itself. Hoover believed government should act, but had to be careful not to take too much power. Hoover believed the government's role should be to help different groups work together to improve the economy. He believed that the government should encourage private groups to provide benefits such as food and shelter to the needy and jobless. He did not think that the government should provide direct monetary aid to people. Hoover met with bankers, business leaders, and labor leaders. He urged them to work together to revive the economy. Despite these efforts, the economic situation simply got worse. People expressed their frustration at the situation. Farmers destroyed some food or refused to work. People without homes began to call their shanty towns Hoovervilles. Fun fact, during the Depression, Hoover lent his name not only to the shanty towns that sprang up everywhere, Hoovervilles, but to Hoover blankets, old newspapers wrapped around the body for warmth, Hoover wagons, broken down automobiles hauled by mules, and Hoover flags, empty pockets turned inside out. He was quoted saying, "Economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement." Hoover did not change his principles and offer direct aid to the jobless and hungry. He did, however, take steps to have a more active government role in the economy. He established a major public works program that included building roads, bridges, and dams to provide jobs. He launched a program to try to raise food prices and urged bankers to join a credit organization that would shore up weaker, smaller banks. Despite the efforts made by President Hoover, by 1932, the economy had still not improved. Congress passed a law to lower the rates for home mortgages, hoping to spur the construction industry. Hoover created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, aimed at funding projects that would create jobs. The RFC was a major change in policy, but it came too late to help. Hoover's popularity among veterans of World War I decreased when he was unable to pay them their bonuses they were promised. Hoover entered the 1932 presidential race as a very unpopular candidate. What next? Take the time to go back and review the lesson on your own. After your review, complete the lesson review for the lesson and submit for grading. Remember, your submission should follow all the rules for standard written English. All submissions must be written in your own words and sources used cited at the end. How to cite sources in APA format. When you reference a source within an APA-style paper, whether it is using a direct quote, repurposing an image, or simply referring to an idea or theory, you should insert an in-text citation, the author's surname and the date of publication within parentheses straight after a direct quote. CitationMachine.net will assist you in creating citations.